The wagon wheel cracked with a sound like a gunshot, sending Sarah McKinnon's heart racing as their makeshift home lurched violently to one side. The November wind cut through the canvas covering like a blade, carrying with it the promise of an early winter that could spell doom for anyone caught unprepared on the Dakota plains. "Mama?" 8-year-old Emma's voice was barely a whisper from beneath the pile of threadbare blankets. Her face, pale as fresh snow, was flushed with fever that had been climbing for 3 days now. The child's breathing came in short, labored gasps that tore at Sarah's soul with each rasp. "It's all right, my darling," Sarah lied, her Irish accent still thick despite 5 years in America. She climbed down from the driver's seat, her worn boots sinking into the frost-hardened earth. The reality of their situation hit her like a physical blow. They were at least 20 miles from the nearest settlement, with a broken wagon, a dying horse, and a daughter whose condition worsened by the hour. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of brown grass and rolling hills beneath a steel-gray sky. Sarah had heard the stories whispered in the trading posts and general stores. This was disputed territory, claimed by the Lakota Sioux who had been fighting to protect their ancestral lands. Just months ago, news had spread like wildfire about General Custer's defeat at the Little Bighorn. The government's response had been swift and brutal, and tensions between the army and the tribes had never been higher. Sarah knelt beside their lame horse, a gentle mare named Molly, who had carried them faithfully from the homestead, where her husband Patrick had died of consumption. The animal's left front leg was badly swollen, and she favored it heavily. Even if Sarah could repair the wheel, Molly wouldn't be able to pull them much further. "What are we going to do, Mama?" Emma's question carried the weight of innocent trust that children place in their parents, the belief that somehow mothers could fix anything. Sarah returned to the wagon and smoothed her daughter's damp hair. Emma's green eyes, so like Patrick's, burned with fever. The child had inherited her father's stubborn spirit and her mother's red hair, but now she looked fragile as spun glass. Sarah's medical knowledge was limited to folk remedies and what she'd learned from other frontier women, but she knew pneumonia when she saw it. Without proper medicine and warm shelter, Emma had perhaps days, maybe less. "We're going to find help," Sarah said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. She looked toward the northwest, where smoke had been rising in thin columns throughout the day. It could be an army patrol, but more likely it was a Lakota camp. The stories she'd heard painted them as savage warriors who showed no mercy to white settlers, but Sarah had also heard other tales, whispered accounts from traders who spoke of honor and hospitality among the plains tribes. As darkness began to creep across the prairie, Sarah made her decision. She gathered their few remaining supplies, a nearly empty water skin, the last of their hardtack, and Patrick's old cavalry pistol with 3 bullets. She wrapped Emma in every blanket they had and lifted her daughter's burning body into her arms. "Where are we going, Mama?" "To find people who might help us," Sarah said, not mentioning that those people might just as easily kill them both. She began walking toward the smoke, each step taking them deeper into territory that white settlers entered at their own peril. The wind picked up as night fell, carrying with it the scent of snow and something else, wood smoke and the distant sound of voices. Sarah's arms ached from carrying Emma, and her legs trembled with exhaustion, but she pressed on. Her daughter's life depended on finding help, and she would walk into hell itself if necessary. After what felt like hours, Sarah stumbled. Her knees hit the frozen ground hard, and Emma cried out weakly. Sarah tried to rise, but her body had reached its limit. The world spun around her, and she felt consciousness slipping away like water through her fingers. "Please," she whispered to the vast Dakota sky, not knowing if she was praying to God or to whatever spirits might inhabit this wild land. "Please don't let her die because of my failures." The last thing Sarah saw before darkness claimed her was the silhouette of horsemen approaching across the prairie, their forms outlined against the star-filled sky. Chief Taharton reined in his war pony as he spotted the collapsed figures near the broken wagon. At 43, he had the weathered face of a man who had seen too much violence and loss, but his dark eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him a respected leader among his people. The recent months had been particularly difficult. Army patrols had increased their presence in the territory, and several young warriors in his band were eager for revenge after hearing news of the massacres at other camps. "Washichu," muttered Wanbli, one of the younger warriors riding beside him. The Lakota word for white people carried contempt in his voice. "We should leave them." How many of our people have they killed? How many of our children have they taken to their schools? Tahatan dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and careful. He approached the unconscious woman and the small child she still held protectively in her arms, even in her collapsed state. The mother's face was gaunt with hunger and exhaustion, her clothes patched and worn thin. But it was the child that gave him pause. She was burning with fever, her small body shaking uncontrollably. "She is dying," said Tasanwi, the medicine woman who had insisted on joining their hunting party despite her advancing years. Her voice carried no judgment, only observation. "The mother as well, if we leave them here. The snow comes tonight." Tahatan knelt beside the woman and child, his trained eye taking in details that told their story. The woman's hands were calloused from hard work, her wedding ring worn thin from years of labor. The child's clothing, though poor, was clean and carefully mended. These were not the wealthy settlers who came to claim Lakota lands with government backing. These were desperate people, refugees of some kind. He thought of his own daughter, Winona, who was close to this child's age. She was safe in their winter camp with her grandmother, but he remembered all too well the nights when she had burned with fever, when he and his late wife had prayed to Wakantanka for her life. The memory of those fears made his decision. "We cannot leave them to die," he said quietly in Lakota, knowing his words would spark debate among his warriors. "Tahatan," Wanbli protested, his voice rising. "They are Washichu, our enemies. The soldiers hunt us like animals, and you would save their children." The chief stood slowly, his full height commanding respect even from the younger warriors. "Look at them, nephew. This woman carries no soldier's uniform. This child bears no weapon against our people. Would you have us become the monsters they claim we are?" Petasanwi nodded approvingly. "The spirits have brought them to us for a reason. To turn our backs on the helpless, regardless of their race, would anger Wakantanka." Another warrior, Chaske, urged his horse closer. "What if it is a trap, my chief? The bluecoats are known for their deception." Tahatan looked again at the unconscious woman and her fevered child. No deception could fake the genuine desperation he saw, the mother's protective grip that hadn't loosened even in unconsciousness. "If it is a trap, it is the cruelest one I have ever seen. No, Chaske, these are simply two human beings in need." The chief gently lifted the child from her mother's arms, surprised by how light she was. The fever radiated through her small body like heat from stones around a fire. He handed her carefully to Ptesanwi, then gathered the unconscious woman, noting how her breathing was shallow and irregular. "But, Tahatan," Wanbli continued, "what will the others say when we bring Washichu into our camp? After everything that has happened?" "They will say their chief chose compassion over hatred," Tahatan replied, settling the woman across his saddle before mounting behind her. "They will say that Tahatan remembered what it means to be Lakota, to be generous to those in need, to protect the helpless, to honor the sacred." As they began the journey back to camp, Tasanwi riding close beside him with the fevered child, Tahatan couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would change everything. The woman stirred slightly in his arms, murmuring something in a language he didn't understand, Irish Gaelic, though he couldn't know that. The snow began to fall as they crested the hill overlooking their winter camp, and Tahatan knew that by morning, the tracks leading to the broken wagon would be covered. These two strangers would disappear into their world, as completely as if they had never existed in the white man's. The question that remained was whether his people would accept his decision and whether the woman and child would survive long enough for any of it to matter. Below them, the warm glow of lodge fires promised shelter from the storm, but Tahatan knew that the real test would come when the woman awakened to find herself in the heart of a Lakota camp, dependent on the mercy of people her own kind had taught her to fear. Sarah's consciousness returned slowly, like emerging from deep water. The first thing she noticed was warmth, blessed, life-giving warmth that she hadn't felt in weeks. The second was the unfamiliar sounds surrounding her, voices speaking in a melodic language she didn't recognize, the crackling of a fire and the soft rustling of what sounded like animal hides. Her eyes opened to a ceiling of tanned buffalo hide, supported by wooden poles, painted with symbols that seemed to dance in the flickering firelight. Panic seized her throat as memories flooded back. The broken wagon, Emma's fever, collapsing on the frozen prairie. She tried to sit up quickly, but gentle hands pressed her back down. "Emma," she gasped, her voice hoarse and desperate. "Where is my daughter?" An elderly Native American woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked braids spoke softly in her own language, then gestured toward the other side of the lodge. Sarah turned her head to see her daughter lying on a bed of soft furs, still pale but breathing more easily than she had in days. A young Lakota woman was carefully spooning what looked like broth between Emma's lips. "She lives," said a deep voice in accented English. Sarah looked up to see a tall, dignified man with long black hair and traditional clothing entering the lodge. This had to be the chief. Everything about his bearing spoke of authority and respect. "Your daughter is very sick, but Tasanwi believes she will recover." Sarah struggled to process what was happening. Everything she'd heard about the Lakota painted them as merciless savages who killed white settlers on sight. Yet here she was, warm and cared for, watching native women tend to her daughter with the same gentle attention they might show their own children. "You're the one who found us," she said, not quite a question. The chief nodded solemnly. "I am Tahatan. You collapsed near our hunting grounds. We could not leave you to die in the snow." His English was careful but clear, learned perhaps from traders or missionaries. Sarah tried to sit up again, this time more slowly. The elderly woman, Patasanwi, the chief had called her, helped her, offering a warm cup that smelled of herbs and something else she couldn't identify. "Why?" Sarah asked, accepting the drink gratefully. "I mean no disrespect, but your people and mine, we're at war." Tahatan settled cross-legged near the fire, his expression thoughtful. "War is what men make when they forget they are human first. Your child needed help, you needed help. That is all that mattered in that moment." The warmth of the lodge and the herb tea began to work their magic, and Sarah felt strength slowly returning to her limbs. She studied the faces around her. Tasanwi, who moved with the confidence of a healer, the young woman feeding Emma, who couldn't be much older than Sarah herself, and Tahatan, whose weathered features spoke of both strength and wisdom. "My name is Sarah McKinnon," she said finally. "My daughter is Emma. We lost everything when my husband died. I was trying to reach my sister in Oregon Territory." "You are far from any road to Oregon," Tahatan observed. Sarah nodded, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "I got lost. The wagon master said we couldn't keep up, so he left us behind. Our horse went lame, and then the wheel broke." She looked toward Emma, who seemed to be swallowing the broth more readily now. "I thought she was going to die out there." "She nearly did," Tasanwi said in English, surprising Sarah. The medicine woman's accent was stronger than the chief's, but her words were clear. The lung sickness had deep hold. "But she is young and the spirit is strong in her." As if sensing her mother's attention, Emma's eyes fluttered open. They were clearer than they had been in days, though she still looked weak and confused. "Mama," she whispered. Sarah moved quickly to her daughter's side, kneeling on the soft furs. "I'm here, sweetheart. How do you feel?" Emma looked around the lodge with wide eyes, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings and the native faces watching her with gentle concern. Instead of fear, curiosity filled her expression. "Are these Indians, Mama?" "Yes, darling, and they saved our lives." The young woman who had been feeding Emma smiled and said something in Lakota to Tahatan. He translated, "Winona says your daughter has the courage of a warrior. She has been taking the medicine without complaint." "Winona?" Emma repeated carefully, looking at the young woman. "Is that your name?" Winona nodded and spoke a few words in English. "Yes, Winona. You." "Emma?" Emma smiled for the first time in weeks. "Yes, I'm Emma. Thank you for the soup, it tastes good." Sarah felt tears threatening as she watched her daughter interact naturally with these people she'd been taught to fear. Children, it seemed, had not yet learned the hatred that divided their peoples. "There is something we must discuss," Tahatan said quietly, his tone becoming more serious. "Many of my people are not happy that I brought you here. There has been much violence between our peoples. Just last month, soldiers attacked a peaceful camp 2 days' ride from here. Women and children died." Sarah's stomach clenched. She'd heard similar stories from the other direction. Tales of raids on homesteads, scalping parties, children taken captive. "What will happen to us?" "That depends on many things," Tahatan replied honestly. "Some of my warriors want you gone as soon as you're able to travel. Others—" He paused, glancing at Emma, who was already drifting back to sleep. "Others have begun to see that perhaps there is another way." Tasanwi added more herbs to the fire, filling the lodge with aromatic smoke. "The child cannot travel for many days. The lung sickness must be fully healed or it will return stronger. She needs warmth, rest, and medicine." Sarah looked between the chief and the medicine woman, understanding the unspoken message. They would be staying here in this Lakota camp for days or perhaps weeks, guests among people many of her own kind, would consider enemies, dependent on the goodwill of those she'd been taught to fear. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly. "Do not thank us yet," Tahatan replied, though his tone was not unkind. "Tomorrow, the council will decide what to do with you. I am chief, but I am not king. My people have voices, and they have been hurt badly by yours." As night settled over the camp and the lodge grew quiet, except for the gentle crackling of the fire, Sarah lay awake, listening to Emma's steady breathing. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the camp settling in for the night. Low voices, dogs barking in the distance, the whinny of horses. Normal sounds of people living their lives, not so different from any frontier settlement. She thought about Patrick, wondering what he would think of their situation. Her husband had been a practical man, a former soldier who understood that survival sometimes meant making choices that others might not understand. She hoped he would approve of her trusting these people with their lives, because at this point, she had no other choice. The morning brought a crystalline cold that made the air itself seem to sparkle. Sarah woke to find Emma sitting up and taking solid food, a thin stew that Winona had brought at dawn. Her daughter's fever had broken completely during the night, and though she was still weak, the dangerous flush was gone from her cheeks. "Look, Mama," Emma said, pointing to the entrance of the lodge where the hide flap had been pulled back slightly. "It snowed so much." Indeed it had. Sarah could see drifts that reached nearly to her waist, confirming that their rescue had been perfectly timed. Another night on the open prairie would have killed them both. Tahatan entered the lodge carrying Sarah's few possessions from the wagon, her husband's pistol, their remaining food, and a small wooden box containing her most precious items, Patrick's letters from the war, their marriage certificate, and a tintype photograph of the three of them taken in Nebraska before Patrick's illness. "Your belongings," he said, settling them carefully beside her. "The wagon was destroyed by the storm, but Molly, your horse, we brought her to camp. She will recover." Sarah was touched by this consideration. "Thank you. I know you didn't have to do that. A horse is valuable," Tahatan replied practically, "but also a person's possessions tell their story. These things matter to you." He was right. Sarah picked up the tintype, looking at Patrick's young face. He'd been so hopeful then, so certain that the West would offer them a better life than the crowded, prejudiced cities of the East, where Irishmen were often treated little better than animals. "Your husband?" Tahatan asked, noting her expression. "Yes, Patrick McKinnon. He died of consumption last spring." Sarah traced her finger over his image. "He was a good man, a soldier in your Civil War, fought to preserve the Union. He believed in doing what was right, even when it was difficult." Tahatan studied the photograph with interest. Many soldiers came west after the war. Some to fight us, others to farm or hunt. "Which kind was your husband?" "The farming kind," Sarah replied without hesitation. "He'd seen enough fighting. He just wanted to build something, to leave Emma something better than we had." A commotion outside the lodge interrupted their conversation. Voices were raised in animated discussion, and Sarah could hear the word Washichu repeated several times with varying degrees of anger or concern. "The council gathers," Tahatan explained, rising to his feet. "They will decide your fate. I must go speak for you." Fear twisted in Sarah's stomach. "What will you tell them?" "The truth, that you are not our enemies, but people in need. That helping you does not make us weak, but shows our strength." He paused at the lodge entrance. "Tesanwi will stay with you. Do not be afraid. Whatever is decided, I will not let harm come to your daughter." After he left, the lodge felt much larger and lonelier. Emma had fallen back asleep, exhausted by the simple effort of eating breakfast. Tesanwi worked quietly, grinding herbs and preparing medicines, occasionally humming what sounded like a lullaby under her breath. "What are they saying out there?" Sarah asked when the voices outside grew particularly heated. Tesanwi looked up from her work, some angry, some scared, all confused. Her English was heavily accented but clear. "Young warriors want glory. Old warriors remember cost of war. Women think of children, yours and ours." Through the lodge walls, Sarah could hear individual voices rising above the general discussion. One voice in particular seemed especially passionate in its opposition, speaking rapidly in Lakota with a tone that needed no translation. "Wanbli," Tesanwi said, noting Sarah's worried expression. Tahatan's nephew. His father killed by soldiers 2 winters past. His anger runs deep like winter river under ice. Sarah nodded, understanding. If soldiers had killed Patrick, she might feel the same rage toward anyone in a blue uniform. What about the others? Chashke leads hunting party. Good man, careful man. He thinks with head, not heart. Wants know what bringing you here means for safety of camp. Tesanwi continued grinding her herbs, the rhythmic sound somehow soothing. Others wait to see which way wind blows. The discussion outside continued for what felt like hours. Occasionally, Sarah heard Tahatan's deeper voice responding to challenges, his tone always measured and calm. She found herself straining to understand the rhythm of the language, trying to gauge from inflection alone whether the debate was going well or poorly. Emma woke briefly and asked for water, which Winona brought along with a shy smile. The young woman had clearly been practicing English words because she managed to say, "Better today," with obvious pride in her pronunciation. "Much better, thank you," Emma replied, then surprised everyone by attempting a Lakota phrase she'd apparently been listening to. "Wapila, thank you." Winona's face lit up with delight, and she clapped her hands softly before launching into a gentle stream of Lakota that was clearly praise for Emma's effort. Even Tesanwi smiled broadly. "She has good ear," the medicine woman told Sarah. "Children learn languages like birds learn songs, naturally." The observation struck Sarah as profound. Perhaps that was the difference. Children didn't carry the weight of history and prejudice that made adults see enemies where they might find friends. Finally, the voices outside began to quiet. Sarah's heart hammered as she heard footsteps approaching the lodge. Tahatan entered, followed by 2 other men Sarah hadn't seen before. One was clearly the angry young warrior, Wanbli, whose face bore the stoic expression of someone who had lost an argument but accepted the decision. The other was older, with graying hair and thoughtful eyes that studied Sarah and Emma carefully. "The council has decided," Tahatan announced. "You may stay until your daughter is fully healed and the weather permits safe travel. But there are conditions." Sarah felt relief flood through her, followed immediately by apprehension about what those conditions might be. Chashka, the older warrior, spoke in careful English. "You work, earn place here with hands, not just need. Show you understand our ways, respect our people. And you learn," Wanbli added, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Learn what soldiers do to camps like ours. Learn why we fight. Learn why some of us do not trust white promises." Sarah looked at these men, enemies according to everything she'd been taught, saviors according to her lived experience, and nodded. "I'll do whatever you ask. I just want my daughter to live." "Then it is settled," Tahatan said. "You are guests in our camp until spring. Use this time wisely, Sarah McKinnon. Learn about us as we learn about you. Perhaps understanding can grow where hatred once lived." As the men left the lodge, Sarah realized that her survival now depended not just on Emma's recovery, but on her ability to bridge 2 worlds that had been at war for decades. The thought was terrifying and hopeful in equal measure. 3 weeks had passed since the council's decision, and Sarah had found her place in the rhythm of camp life. Her hands, already calloused from frontier hardship, now bore new marks from helping the women tan hides, gather winter firewood, and prepare the endless meals needed to feed a community through the harsh Dakota winter. Emma had recovered completely, her laughter now a familiar sound around the campfires. She played with the other children, switching effortlessly between English and the Lakota words she absorbed like a sponge. More than once, Sarah had watched her daughter teaching other children simple English phrases while learning traditional games that had been played on these plains for generations. On this particular morning, Sarah was working with Winona to repair a torn lodge covering when a commotion arose from the camp's eastern edge. Riders were approaching, but these weren't returning hunters. The tension in the voices around her told Sarah immediately that something was wrong. Tahatan emerged from his lodge, already reaching for his rifle. Other warriors did the same, and Sarah felt the familiar cold grip of fear in her stomach. She had learned enough Lakota to understand the shouted words, "Soldiers coming." "How many?" Tahatan called out in English, perhaps for Sarah's benefit. 20, maybe more," replied the scout who had ridden in with the warning. "Blue coats. They follow our trail from the hunting grounds." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She knew what this meant. Army patrols had been searching for Lakota camps all winter, and their presence here had been discovered. Worse, if the soldiers found her and Emma among the Lakota, it would be seen as evidence that the tribe was holding white captives, justifying whatever violence might follow. "You must hide," Winona said urgently, grasping Sarah's arm. "If soldiers see you here—" But Sarah shook her head, a sudden clarity filling her mind. She thought of Patrick, of his belief in doing what was right, even when it was difficult. She thought of Tahatan's courage in saving them, and Pitesanwi's gentle care of Emma. These people had risked everything to help strangers, and now their kindness might be used against them. "No," she said firmly, "I won't hide." She found Emma playing with the other children and quickly explained what was happening. Her daughter's eyes grew wide with fear, but she nodded with the same courage that had carried her through fever and hardship. "What are you doing?" Wanbley demanded, as Sarah walked toward the edge of camp where the warriors were taking defensive positions. "What needs to be done?" Sarah replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. The soldiers appeared over the ridge like a dark cloud against the snow. Sarah could see their leader, a young lieutenant with the rigid bearing of someone trying to prove himself. Behind him rode a mixed group of cavalry and what looked like territorial militia, men whose faces bore the hard lines of those who had seen too much violence on the frontier. "Oh, the camp!" the lieutenant called out, his voice carrying across the winter air. "I am Lieutenant Morrison of the 7th Cavalry. We're looking for a missing woman and child, Irish settlers who disappeared from a broken wagon 3 weeks ago." Tahatan stepped forward, his bearing dignified despite being vastly outnumbered. "I am Tahatan, chief of this band. We have heard nothing of missing settlers." It was technically true, Sarah realized. They hadn't been missing, they had been found. Lieutenant Morrison's eyes swept the camp, taking in the defensive positions, the women and children watching from behind the lodges, the warriors ready for battle. "We have reason to believe they may have been taken captive. We're prepared to search this camp." "You have no authority here," Tahatan replied calmly. "This is sovereign territory, under the Treaty of Fort Laramie." "Treaties are just paper," one of the militiamen called out, his hand moving to his rifle. "Especially after what you savages did to Custer." Sarah saw the situation spiraling toward violence, the kind of tragic misunderstanding that had fueled decades of warfare between the two peoples. Young warriors on both sides were ready to fight, their hands on their weapons, their faces set with the grim determination of men who expected to die. That's when Sarah McKinnon, Irish immigrant widow and mother, made the choice that would define not just her own fate, but potentially the fate of everyone in the camp. She stepped out from behind the lodge where she had been standing, Emma's hand firmly clasped in hers. "Lieutenant Morrison," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the space between the two groups. "I'm Sarah McKinnon. I believe you're looking for me." The effect was immediate and dramatic. The soldiers straightened in their saddles, clearly not expecting to see a white woman walking freely among the Lakota. The lieutenant's face showed confusion, then suspicion. "Mrs. McKinnon? We were told you and your daughter had been taken captive by hostile Indians." Sarah walked forward slowly, Emma beside her, until she stood next to Tahatan. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present, a white woman choosing to stand with the Lakota chief rather than run to her rescuers. "We were never captives, Lieutenant," Sarah said clearly. "Chief Tahatan and his people saved our lives when we were dying in the snow. They've cared for us, fed us, and treated us with more kindness than we had any right to expect." The lieutenant's confusion deepened. This didn't fit the narrative he'd been prepared for. "Ma'am, you're free to go. We'll escort you to safety." "I am safe," Sarah replied. "These people are not our enemies, Lieutenant. They're human beings trying to survive a winter that would kill anyone caught unprepared. They showed mercy to strangers when they had every reason not to." One of the militiamen spurred his horse forward. "Don't let her fool you, Lieutenant. Indians are probably threatening her kid to make her say this. It's an old trick." Emma stepped forward then, her 8-year-old voice clear and strong. "No one is threatening us. Winona taught me how to make dolls from corn husks. Pitesanwi made medicine that saved my life when I was sick, and Chief Tahatan carried me here when I was too weak to walk." The pure honesty in the child's voice seemed to cut through the tension like a blade. Lieutenant Morrison looked from Emma to Sarah to Tahatan, clearly struggling with a situation his training had never prepared him for. "Mrs. McKinnon," he said finally, "I have orders to bring you and your daughter to Fort Robinson. There are people worried about you." Sarah nodded. "I understand, Lieutenant, and we'll come with you, but not as rescued captives. We'll come as guests who have finished visiting friends." She turned to Tahatan, speaking in the mixture of English and Lakota that had become natural during their stay. "Wapila, my friend, thank you for showing me that courage isn't just about fighting. Sometimes it's about choosing mercy when the world expects revenge." Tahatan clasped her hand in the traditional way she had learned. "You have shown courage too, Sarah McKinnon. You could have stayed hidden, but you chose to speak truth even when it was dangerous." The parting was difficult, but Asanwi pressed a bundle of herbs into Sarah's hands for the journey. Winona gave Emma a small beaded bracelet she had made. Even Wanbli, who had opposed their presence from the beginning, nodded respectfully as they prepared to leave. "Will we see you again?" Emma asked Winona in her carefully practiced Lakota. Winona smiled and replied in English, "The world is big but not so big. Perhaps our paths will cross again." As they rode away with the soldiers, Sarah looked back at the camp where she had learned that enemies could become friends, that understanding could bridge even the deepest cultural divides, and that sometimes the greatest courage lay not in fighting, but in choosing compassion over fear. Lieutenant Morrison rode beside her in thoughtful silence for most of the journey. Finally he spoke. "Ma'am, what you did back there, speaking up for those Indian, it could have gone badly." Sarah adjusted Emma in front of her on the saddle, her daughter already drowsy from the warm sun and steady rhythm of travel. "Lieutenant, 3 weeks ago I would have been as frightened of those people as your men were today. But fear and ignorance are luxuries that people like me can't afford. When you're dying, you learn quickly that the color of the hand that helps you doesn't matter, only the kindness in the heart that extends it." The lieutenant was quiet for a long time after that. When they finally reached Fort Robinson, Sarah's story spread quickly through the frontier settlements. Some dismissed it as the confused gratitude of a woman who didn't understand her own captivity. Others, particularly those who had struggled to survive on the harsh frontier themselves, understood that survival often required looking beyond old prejudices to find unexpected allies. Sarah and Emma never made it to Oregon. Instead, they settled in a small town near the fort, where Sarah worked as a seamstress and occasionally as a translator when peaceful negotiations were needed with local tribes. Emma grew up speaking both English and Lakota fluently, becoming a bridge between worlds that had too often been separated by misunderstanding and fear. Years later, when historians wrote about the Indian Wars of the 1870s, most focused on the battles and the famous defeats. Few recorded the smaller stories, the moments when enemies chose mercy over vengeance, when understanding triumphed over prejudice, when a desperate Irish mother and a compassionate Lakota chief proved that humanity could transcend the boundaries that politics and history had drawn between their peoples. But Sarah McKinnon remembered, and in the small town where she raised her daughter, where former soldiers and peaceful Indians sometimes shared the same trading post, she made sure that others remembered too, because some stories, she believed, were too important to be forgotten. Stories about the day when a Lakota chief stepped down from his horse and carried a dying child, not because she was white or Lakota, but simply because she was a human being in need of help. And that, Sarah knew, was a lesson the frontier and the world desperately needed to learn.